"No, Senator Vance, you don't get to decide which Americans deserve dignity." The words cut through the room like a knife. The Senate chamber, usually a dull sea of murmurs and formality, had fallen into stunned silence. All eyes locked on the young assemblyman from Queens, his voice shaking slightly. Not from fear, but fury. Zohran Mamdani had just done what no one else dared. He stood up, not with polite disagreement, but with raw, unapologetic truth, challenging Vice President JD Vance to his face during a live televised session. What led to this confrontation? Why did Mamdani risk everything, his alliances, his reputation, possibly even his career, to call out a man second only to the president? And more importantly, what did JD Vance say to provoke such defiance? It began weeks earlier, buried in the quiet folds of committee transcripts, when Vance had proposed a new immigration measure, one that would strip healthcare access from undocumented children, effectively punishing them for being born on the wrong side of a border. He framed it as economic realism, but to Mamdani, it was cruelty in a suit. The outrage didn't come overnight. It built slowly, like pressure behind a dam. Zohran watched as moderate Democrats offered only mild criticism, their eyes glued to polling numbers instead of moral lines. Even progressive voices fell unusually quiet. But he couldn't stay silent. He wouldn't. Because he knew what it felt like to be the other. He carried those memories in his bloodstream, his name, his skin, his heritage, all reminders that some Americans are always asked to prove they belong. So when the Senate session convened that Monday, and JD Vance smugly declared, "We need to stop pretending everyone is entitled to the American dream," something broke. Not just in Zohran, but in the entire room. There was no script for what he did next. He walked to the microphone uninvited, stared directly into the face of power, and said what no one else would. "Your policies are not economics. They are eugenics with a budget plan." A gasp, then dead silence, then murmurs. Some senators stood, some walked out. JD Vance leaned back, trying to laugh it off, but his face had gone pale. In that moment, the hierarchy cracked. But Zohran didn't stop there. He invoked real stories. A 7-year-old girl from El Paso with leukemia whose mother worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford treatment. He read letters from American-born children terrified that their parents would be deported under Vance's plan. And then he said it. If protecting billionaires' tax cuts is patriotic, but feeding hungry children is socialism, then maybe it's not me who doesn't understand America. Maybe it's you. Was it planned? Not exactly, but every word had been living inside him for years. The media exploded. Headlines screamed across screens. Mamdani versus Vance, the speech that shook the Senate. Overnight, Zohran went from obscure assemblyman to national symbol of resistance. Cable networks played the clip on loop. Social media turned it into a rallying cry. And JD Vance? He tried to dismiss it as a tantrum from the radical left. But no one missed the way his hands trembled when asked about it again. Still, this was just the beginning. Because what Zohran said that day would trigger investigations, leaks, and revelations no one saw coming. Secrets buried deep in the vice president's legislative record. And when the truth started to spill, it wasn't just about immigration anymore. It was about power, corruption, and the price of silence. If you're feeling this, don't scroll past. Take a second to subscribe. That's how we keep these stories alive. In the days that followed the confrontation, Zohran Mamdani barely slept. His inbox was flooded. Thousands of emails poured in. Some hateful, but most grateful. Parents, students, immigrants, teachers, even disillusioned conservatives. They all said the same thing. Thank you for saying what we couldn't. But Zohran didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Because something in JD Vance's eyes that day, it wasn't just anger. It was fear. And fear meant there was something worth hiding. It started small. A late-night message from a former Vance staffer who refused to give a name. Just 2 lines. Look into the Cincinnati contracts. It's bigger than immigration. Then nothing. But it was enough. Zohran quietly reached out to an investigative journalist he trusted. Someone who owed him nothing. Someone with a reputation for taking risks. Together, they began combing through publicly available records. JD Vance's career had always looked polished. Ivy League, tech investor, best-selling author, vice president. But beneath the surface, cracks appeared. They found oddities, a series of healthcare infrastructure contracts signed during Vance's time as Ohio's senator, funneled to a company run by a former college roommate. The contracts had been masked as opioid treatment programs. In reality, they diverted millions toward lobbying efforts to dismantle Medicaid expansions. The kicker? That same company had donated heavily to the very political PAC that launched Vance's vice presidency. And yet, it wasn't just money. It was intent. The documents showed that Vance had personally revised sections of the healthcare policy to exclude children of undocumented immigrants, long before he ever brought it to the Senate floor. The cruelty wasn't a byproduct. It was the plan. Zohran had the proof. But the question loomed. What now? Going public would trigger a war. The vice president's office had already begun painting Mamdani as a reckless radical, accusing him of trying to dismantle the government from within. Conservative media pounced. They aired old footage of Zohran at protests, twisting them to look like riots. They dug into his background, mocked his accent, questioned his patriotism. It was exhausting. But he didn't flinch. He called a press conference. No notes, no teleprompter. Just his voice. Raw, unwavering. I don't care if I lose every donor I've ever had. I don't care if I'm blacklisted from every newsroom in this country. What I do care about is the child in Ohio who didn't get treatment because the vice president prioritized politics over lives. That child had a name. Her name was Talia, and she died. I've seen the records. Reporters gasped. One shouted a question. Are you accusing JD Vance of criminal negligence? Zohran didn't blink. No, I'm accusing him of something worse, knowing, planning, and profiting from suffering. Within hours, it was everywhere. Hashtags exploded. Congressional calls for an ethics inquiry erupted. The White House released a carefully worded statement expressing confidence in the vice president, but the tone was different, uneasy. And behind the scenes, Vance's team scrambled. Memos leaked, staffers resigned, donors backed out. One senator, caught on a hot mic, muttered, "We're hemorrhaging." But for Zohran, it was never about the politics. It was about restoring something that felt almost extinct, moral clarity. He didn't want applause. He wanted answers, accountability, justice. And yet, with every truth revealed, the threats grew louder. One night he received a handwritten letter slipped under his office door. No name, just one sentence, scrawled in red ink. You don't know how deep this goes. If you believe stories like this matter, take a second to leave a comment. Your voice might be the reason someone else speaks up too. The letter changed everything. Zohran Mamdani stared at the red ink for a long time, the words looping in his head like a warning bell. You don't know how deep this goes. It wasn't just a threat. It was a signal. Someone on the inside wanted him to keep digging. So he did. With the help of the same journalist, they traced the healthcare contracts to a larger shell network. 6 companies with almost identical business addresses in 3 states, all tied to one central figure, Martin Sloan, a longtime GOP fundraiser with direct ties to JD Vance's Senate office. But Sloan wasn't just a donor. He was also the registered owner of a charter school in Columbus, one that had recently shut down under mysterious circumstances after receiving a multi-million-dollar federal grant, co-sponsored by Vance himself. Where did the money go? No one knew. The pieces started to fit together. Painfully. Precisely. It wasn't just about excluding immigrants. It was about siphoning money from public programs, using policy as a weapon, and building an empire behind a curtain of patriotism and Christian values. And the deeper Zohran went, the more dangerous it became. Suddenly, his phone was glitching. Staffers noticed strange men lingering outside the office late at night. One intern's car tires were slashed, another was followed home. The message was clear. Back off. But if they thought fear would silence him, they had the wrong man. Zohran had grown up watching his mother weep in silence after being treated like a criminal at airport checkpoints. He'd seen his neighbors evicted from rent-stabilized apartments by billion-dollar developers. He'd been called a foreigner in his own city, in his own language. He knew what it meant to be erased, and he had promised himself years ago that if he ever had a microphone, he would use it. So he called for a full congressional investigation. On record. On camera. And once again, he didn't hold back. "There's a rot in our system," he said, looking directly at the press gallery. "It doesn't wear a mask or hide in back rooms. It wears tailored suits, smiles for cameras, and passes laws that kill people quietly." Reporters were stunned. Even progressive politicians hesitated to echo his language. But across the country, something unexpected happened. Small-town mayors, teachers' unions, nurses, even veterans. They began releasing statements of support. Not because they agreed with every policy Mamdani had ever proposed, but because they recognized truth when they heard it. Meanwhile, Vance grew more erratic. He attacked Mamdani on national television, calling him an extremist plant and an enemy of the American family. But the words fell flat. Something had changed. His charisma was cracking, his mask slipping. Then came the leak. An anonymous source released internal vice presidential memos outlining strategic efforts to undermine Medicaid funding while quietly expanding tax havens for pharmaceutical corporations. The dates matched the shutdown of clinics across 3 states, including the one that had turned away Talia, the girl Zohran had named in his press conference. The public exploded. News anchors used words like fraud, blood money, and human cost. JD Vance's approval rating dropped 22 points in a week. Whistleblowers lined up, and for the first time, the phrase resignation appeared in headlines next to his name. But Zohran didn't celebrate, because he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The system wasn't built to collapse from a single truth. It was designed to outlast outrage, to survive scandal, to rebrand, reshape, and resurface. But Zohran also knew something else, that if people stayed awake, if they didn't forget, if they kept pressing, then maybe, just maybe, the cycle could break. Sometimes, all it takes is a crack of light for the truth to flood in. If you're still with us, drop a comment. Say, "I'm watching." It helps more than you think. They told him to stop. Not in whispers anymore, not in veiled warnings. This time it was blunt. One of Zohran Mamdani's own colleagues, someone he'd campaigned beside, someone who'd once called him the conscience of the chamber, pulled him aside and said it straight. "You're making powerful people nervous. That's not a compliment. It's a death sentence." But he didn't flinch, because by now the stakes were bigger than his name, his seat, or even his safety. People were waking up. They weren't just outraged, they were organizing. Nurses held walkouts in solidarity. Immigrant rights groups plastered cities with posters that read, "Zohran speaks for us." 1,000 high school students in Cincinnati staged a protest in front of the very charter school JD Vance had once funded. Then came the hearing, broadcast live, millions watching. JD Vance sat before the committee like a man trying to outrun his own shadow, his jaw clenched, his answers rehearsed. Every question met with deflection. I do not recall. That was under advisement. These matters are still under legal review. But then it was Zohran's turn to speak. He didn't shout. He didn't perform. He simply opened a folder, laid it gently on the desk, and read aloud the final letter from Talia's mother. Her daughter's name had been stripped from medical eligibility because of a clause Vance had personally signed. That clause saved the state $32,000. The same week, Vance's political committee received a $50,000 donation from the same healthcare firm. Silence. Zohran looked up. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of a nation's exhaustion. This isn't about left or right. This is about life and death. And we deserve better than leaders who see our children as line items. JD Vance didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. The aftermath was seismic. Within 48 hours, a bipartisan coalition called for Vance's resignation. His legal team went into lockdown. Ethics investigations turned into criminal inquiries. And Mamdani, he didn't gloat. He didn't tweet victory. He went home, to his mother's kitchen, to the same place where he once wrote campaign flyers by hand. He sat down, turned off his phone, and cried for the first time in weeks, not because he'd won, but because he'd survived. The next morning, he returned to work. Same subway, same jacket, same bag heavy with papers. But everything had changed. People greeted him on the street, not with fame, but with familiarity. "Thank you," they said. "You made us feel seen." And for a man who'd spent his life being treated like a guest in his own country, there was no greater victory. This story didn't end with applause. It ended with accountability, and the quiet, steady belief that one voice, when it refuses to back down, can echo loud enough to shake the walls of power. If that moved you, just take a second to subscribe. No big speech, just a small click that tells the algorithm you care about truth. And if you've ever felt unseen, you're not alone, not anymore.